Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. As you can see from the title, today we're talking all about feeding tubes. If you are new to my channel, hi, I'm Chrissy and I'm a mum of 3. 2 of my 3 children have additional needs. So my eldest son Zachary has autism and my daughter Avery has cerebral palsy. You would have seen the disclaimer at the beginning of the video, but just because of the nature of this video, I just want to reiterate, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical professional in any way. I am simply just sharing my experiences and the things I've learned along the way in our journey so far. If you do have any medical concerns, then please see a doctor or a medical professional. With that said, I have my notes. I have Avery on the monitor, she's sleeping at the moment, and let's get into the video. So what's a feeding tube and why would someone need one? The answer's in the name. A feeding tube is an alternative method to get nutrition and hydration into the body for someone who can't eat or drink in the conventional way. There's many reasons why someone would need a feeding tube. In Avery's case, she had a cardiac arrest at 3 days old and it left her with a hypoxic brain injury. Because of that, she has poor coordination and a weak swallow, therefore it is unsafe for her to eat and drink in the conventional way. There's lots of other reasons. You'll often see premature babies with feeding tubes. That's because they're so new and those reflexes haven't kicked in yet. There's cancers, there's digestive disorders, there's muscular disorders. When you think about it, the muscles in the throat and the tongue and the brain, they all work together, and when they're not working properly, there may be a reason why you can't coordinate or you can't swallow properly. I'm sure there's many reasons I've not mentioned, but I will reiterate again, I am not a doctor, so I'm not an expert in that field. There's different types of feeding tubes. I'm familiar with the NG tube and the G tube. Avery's had both, so I feel as though I've got a good understanding on both, good enough that I can actually share my experiences and my opinions on both of them. NG tube stands for Nasogastric Tube and it looks like this. They come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. Avery in particular had the 50cm, which is the length of the actual tube, and she had a 6 French, which is the width of the tube. The end of the tube would go up Avery's nose and it would pass down her throat, past her lungs, past her esophagus and into her stomach. And the way we would test to make sure it was in the right place in her stomach is by using pH strips. So the contents we would pull from the tube with a syringe, we would then test, and if it was acidic it would then suggest that it was in her stomach. This is the tube we actually have the most experience in terms of time. The other tube we're familiar with is the G tube, which stands for Gastrostomy Tube. The Gastrostomy Tube is inserted straight into the skin and into the stomach through the abdomen. Obviously, because of that, there is surgery involved when it comes to inserting the tube. From what I know, there's 2 types of G tube. One is where the tube actually stays hanging out of the stomach. I believe it's called a peg. And the other is a button, which is what Avery has. I know of 2 buttons. There's the Mickey button and the mini button. Avery has the mini. Now these are both fairly similar. There's maybe a slight difference in size, but overall they look the same and they work in the same way. Again, the buttons come in different sizes. This one in particular, I believe, is a 1.2cm, which is the length of the actual tube, and it is a 12 French. So G tubes generally are much bigger in width than NG tubes are, because obviously the NG tube has got to go up the nose and down the throat. It has an inflatable balloon on the end of it, which is what keeps it secured in the stomach. For a button, you do need an extension, and this is the extension that we use for Avery's. The end of the extension is fitted into Avery's button, and then we can connect her syringes to the end of the extension, and that's how we feed her through the button. I hope that all made sense. I'm probably not the best at explaining things just because, once again, I am not a doctor, but that is as much information that I can give based on the experience that we've had. So let's talk about the NG tube and the things that we found helpful when my daughter had one. The procedure to insert or pass an NG tube is relatively simple, and I'll get to why I did this in just a second. But in terms of passing an NG tube, there is obviously no surgery involved. The tube simply goes up the nose and goes down through the esophagus and into the stomach. So it can be done at home once trained. So no hospital admission, no healing time and no downtime needed. And to go alongside that, it is also very easily removed. So again, no hospital admission and no surgery to remove it. This makes the NG an incredibly good option if a feeding tube is only required for a short amount of time. Avery had her NG tube from just after her event at about 3 days old, all the way up till she was around 14 months, I want to say, while we were waiting for her G tube surgery. In addition to that, it is also relatively simple to change the tube when it needs to be changed, and again, I will get to why I did that in just a little bit. I'm also going to add to the pros list that it is all one piece. So the tube is one piece, there's no extension, so there's nothing that you have to fit on and then remove either side of a feed. Another benefit is that we could actually vent Avery's stomach, so if she had some trapped wind that we were really struggling to get out of her, we could simply attach a syringe to the end of the tube and just let the air come out on its own. But that's not just a benefit of the NG tube, we can also do that with the G tube as well. And last but definitely not least, obviously she was getting fed. So she couldn't eat in the conventional way, so the tube meant that she could get nutrition into her body. That is probably the #1 benefit of the NG tube. Let's move on to the things that we didn't find so helpful about the NG tube. First, I'm going to address the reason why I kept doing this. Yes, the NG tube is simple to pass and remove in terms of there is no surgery or healing time. However, it was not a pleasant experience for either me, my husband, or for Avery. The procedure involved us literally having to hold her down while we passed this tube up her nose, through her throat and down into her stomach. So you can imagine having something go up your nose and down your throat. It's not very comfortable. Overall, just not a nice experience, not something we love doing, and we're definitely glad that we're not doing that anymore. Alongside that, there was obviously always a tube up her nose and down her throat. So I can imagine that wasn't very comfortable for her. I have heard adults say that the tube isn't very comfortable. The feeling in general just wasn't very nice for her. Tape changes, definitely a con. So Avery's tapes didn't stick to her face very well, which meant we were constantly changing them at least every few days. And again, that was a whole nother procedure of its own. We would have to hold her down, peel these tapes off of her face and then retape it down. So uncomfortable for her, horrible for us to watch and do, and again, something that we don't miss at all. The tapes also irritated her face. If we repassed a tube into the other nostril, she would end up with a rash on the other side for a while, just while that skin was healing from being taped up for so long. Another setback we found with the NG tube is that we were quite limited with what feed and what medicines we could give to Avery. The tube was very easily blocked. It was only a 6 French, which meant it was quite small. And there was a time where one of her medicines was a crushed pill form, and there was a few times where it got blocked and then we had to completely repass a new tube. You do have more options with the G tube, which I will get to in just a little bit. Let's talk reflux. Now, this is a tricky one because I have read that reflux can be made worse by an NG tube, which does make sense because you do have a tube going down your throat. So where the sphincter is supposed to close, it obviously can't because there's something in the way. A way that someone described it to me once is it's like putting a sock in a doorway and then trying to shut the door on that sock. Obviously the door's not going to close properly, and it was the same with her throat. So it can make reflux worse, it can cause reflux. However, Avery has always had severe reflux, and the reflux hasn't gone away with the G tube. I'm not saying the G tube can make reflux better. As a matter of fact, the surgeon told us it could make it worse. So that's a tricky one, but I wanted to throw it in there because there is research to suggest that the NG tube can cause reflux. The biggest issues for us with the NG tube were the risks. The NG tube obviously bypasses the lungs on the way to the stomach. So if there was ever any movement in Avery's tube, if we weren't checking it properly every single time before we fed her or gave her meds, we could potentially have drowned her lungs, which was a terrifying thought. Now, we were fully stocked up on pH strips, which meant that we were always testing to make sure the tube was in her stomach, but because she is on anti-reflux medication, that can turn her stomach contents a lot more alkaline, which made it a bit tricky to actually test her stomach contents. Just in case you've got no clue what I'm talking about, the contents in the stomach run acidic. So if you pull an aspirate out of Avery's stomach and it tests to be acidic, then you can be confident that that tube is in her stomach. But if it is neutral or if it's alkaline, then there's a possibility that the tube isn't in the right place and you're not going to be feeding into the stomach, which can potentially lead to a lot of complications. And with that in mind, Avery is pump fed, and the reason why we chose to pump feed is because we can control the rate, we can make sure she's not fed too fast, meaning that we can try and ease a little bit of the discomfort caused by the reflux. We did get the go ahead from our dietitian to pump feed Avery while she was on the G tube, but we had to keep a close eye on her at all times. So if she was being fed, we pretty much had to be sat right next to her because, again, if there was any movement in that tube, that pump would be pumping milk straight onto her lungs. Again, that's a terrifying thought, so we had to watch her like a hawk through every single feed. Avery didn't really have much movement in her arms because of her hypotonia, so she never really brought her hands to her face, but a lot of children and babies can bring their hands to their face, and it is very easy just to pull out that tube. So once it's pulled out, you have to repass a new one, go through that entire procedure all over again. The last downside I have, which I'll admit is a little bit superficial, is that obviously the tube is on the face, so you can see it in plain sight. The tape's covered about half of Avery's cheek, but like I said, that is completely superficial, and Avery is beautiful with and without the NG tube. I can't speak for anyone else, but I can imagine if there was ever a time when I needed an NG tube, it would make me feel quite self-conscious. That's everything I could think of regarding the G tube. So with all that said, let's move on to the G tube. Avery had her G tube inserted at the end of April this year, so it is still quite new to us, but I do feel as though I've had enough experience to share my opinions on it so far. Again, I'm going to talk about what we found beneficial first. I think the best advantage that we found with the G tube is that it takes away the aspiration risk. So we know that that tube goes directly into her stomach, so it doesn't bypass her lungs like the NG tube did. This means that her pump feeds are much less risky, and I can actually leave the room now when she's being fed, knowing that she's going to be safe. This gives us a lot more options in terms of the rate of feed, so if ever there was a time when Avery just couldn't cope with high volumes, we could actually adapt the rate of her feed so that she was getting a tiny bit each hour, and we could potentially run that feed all day and even through the night. There's no more tape changes, no more messing with her face every few days, no more making her irritated by doing it, which is a massive bonus. We haven't done a tube change yet, but from what I know, it is much more comfortable to have that tube changed. Whenever I have to move Avery's G tube at all or twist it, it doesn't seem to cause her any discomfort. The button is also supposed to be fairly simple to change and can be changed at home in the community. We can also vent the tube like with the NG tube. We can just vent any extra air in her stomach that we're struggling to get out with a syringe. One pro that we haven't tested yet, but we are going to in the future, is that there are many more options when it comes to the G tube, purely because it's not so thin. So feeds can be slightly thicker, tablets can go down the tube much easier when they are crushed into water, which moves me on to my next point, which is blended diet. Now, I'm not going to go too much into this just because we haven't actually tested it yet, and when I do, I'm hoping to do a whole video on its own about blended diet, but it's basically real foods blended up and gone straight down the tube. It's not really an option for the NG tube. I know there are people that do it, but because Avery's tube was so small, the likelihood of it getting blocked was high, and we didn't want to take that risk and then have to constantly change out her tube. So we're waiting for her G tube to heal fully, and then we are going to give that a go. Because the button sits on Avery's tummy, it can be easily covered up with clothing, which means that she is less likely to be able to pull that out. And because you can cover it with clothing, it is much lower profile. So, I mean, if we took Avery out, no one would even know she had a G tube until it was actually time to feed her. I believe the peg is still quite low profile, but the button is even more so because it is just a small button that sits on the surface of her tummy. And I am going to add this just because, like with the NG tube, it is a pro. It feeds her, so it's doing its purpose. The number one downside to Avery having the G tube is the fact that it is a surgery insertion. So she did have to be admitted into hospital. I believe she was there for 2 to 3 nights. She had to recover from that surgery. She needed the downtime for the healing. It is still healing at this time. I believe they say it's fully healed usually at around 3 months post-op. And she also needed to have stitches, which then needed to be removed a couple of weeks after the operation. However, Avery did manage to pop 2 of those stitches on her own, which landed us a trip into our local hospital just to get it checked over. With surgery always comes risk, the most common being infection. The stoma is an open and exposed hole into the body, which means it is exposed to infection, but that will always be a risk and something that we need to look out for and make sure we're cleaning her stoma properly and keeping it well maintained to try and avoid any more nasty infections. The stoma does need to be cleaned every single day, which obviously is an extra step in our routine every single day. It doesn't take long, so it's not that much of a negative, but I've added it in here just because it is something extra you have to do every day that you wouldn't have to do with the NG tube. Because Avery has a button, like I said, it does need an extension. So unless we want to keep that extension taped to her the whole time, which kind of takes away the purpose of having the button in the first place, we need to attach and remove that extension every time either side of her feed, which again, not really much of a negative, but it is an extra step that we didn't have to do with the NG tube. If Avery was able to pull out her G G-tube at some point, it has a very small window of getting another tube into that stoma before it'll heal over. I believe it's around 20 minutes, could be a little bit more, could be a little bit less, but you don't have much time to react. So if that happened through the night, especially if it was not long after we'd gone to bed, the likelihood that that stoma would still be open in the morning is really, really slim. So that would then mean she would have to go back to hospital to have it reinserted in theatre again. So it would essentially be another surgery. That isn't necessarily just a risk of Avery pulling it out. The button is held in by a water-filled balloon, and obviously balloons can deflate, they can pop, anything can go wrong with the balloon, which means that that tube would then just slide on out. You do have to replace the water in the balloon once a week as well, again just to make sure that the water that was inside it before hasn't evaporated too much, and just to keep on top of the maintenance and put fresh water in it. This isn't really relevant to us because Avery has the button and not the peg, but if she did have the peg, to have that removed or then changed into a button, she would have had to go in for another surgery. So for the peg, it's surgery to be inserted and surgery for it to be removed. Let's talk granulation tissue. Now I might insert some pictures, so if you are squeamish you might just want to skip ahead past this part. I'm not going to be the best at explaining what granulation tissue is, but from what I know, it's kind of a build-up of tissue and blood vessels. The best way I can describe it is if you've ever had a piercing and you've had a keloid form on it, that is essentially what granulation tissue is, except it looks a little bit more gnarly when it's around a G-tube. If you catch it, it bleeds like mad, it doesn't look very comfortable, so that's definitely a negative. Avery did have some granulation tissue for a little while. We did manage to get rid of it fairly quickly, but from what I know, it is something that can keep coming back. So in conclusion, in my opinion, there are both pros and cons to both the NG and the G-tube. For our family and for Avery, I am 100% team G-tube. I just think it's so much better for her, and in my opinion, it is a much better option, especially for long-term tube feeding. I am grateful for the NG tube because obviously for the first year of Avery's life, it was giving her all of her nutrition. And fed is always best, irregardless of the method. If you did enjoy the video, then please give it a thumbs up and hit the notification bell so that you're notified of all of my future uploads. And I'll see you all next Wednesday with another video. Bye guys.